thanks so much for joining us here today, despite the coronavirus.
Yeah.
I wanted to start by asking how you got into the film industry and what attracted you to movies to start with.
So I got started in the early 80s. I left school and travelled, and I didn't particularly want to go into higher education. It wasn't really for me. And when I came back to London, which was in actually the late 70s, while I'd been away, I'd worked while I was in New Zealand. I'd got a casual job as a props assistant on a TV show, just coincidentally. Excuse me. And I sort of slightly got the bug. I liked the smell of what a film set felt like and all the rest of it. And so when I came back, I sort of had my antennae up for looking for opportunities to get into the industry. It was very different in those days, and it was extremely difficult because it was a closed shop. The unions hadn't been bashed up at that point, so it was you couldn't really. It was sort of impregnable, the industry. Very luckily, I had a friend who was working for a company called Video Arts, and Video Arts was a company that was run by John Cleese and a group of other people, and they wrote, produced, made little films that were for training films for the workplace. It was pre-video, pre-DVD, pre-internet, pre-all of that basically, and then they controlled the distribution of those films as well, and they put them out to companies on 16mm. And it was a very successful little sort of mini version of the way the movie industry works. And I worked with a guy called Charlie Crichton, who was a Ealing comedy director, and he was about 75, between 75 and 80, and he directed these films, and he put me under his wing, Charlie, basically, and I liked him very much. And so I worked on a number of these films. Now, at this point, which is, let's say, around about the beginning of the 80s, there was a sort of perfect storm of opportunity emerging for a budding young producer. Like I said, the unions, when I first arrived, there was very unionised, but at this point, Mrs. Thatcher was smashing the trades unions up, basically, so that the whole thing became more open for people to get into who hadn't got some sort of inside route into it. Is that Channel 4 was just beginning. But you know, in the late 70s, there were only 3 TV channels in Britain. There was the BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV, basically, and Channel 4 arrived, and that was specifically to commission independent type productions. And thirdly, and the most important for me, was that music videos were beginning. MTV had just begun. And here was an opportunity for young people to make films, basically, is directors to direct, producers to produce, cameramen to light, and all the rest of it. And from my lowly position at Video Arts, I thought, I saw these guys who all called themselves producers, and I thought, well, that's the job, because they don't seem to do very much, and they get to take all the money. So that's the one for me. And in one fell swoop, I thought, well, okay, that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to start doing it in music videos. And this is when I was about 23 or 24, and I formed a company to make music videos with a woman named Sarah Radcliffe, who was my first business partner. I met her socially, I think, and she was producing the first series of the comic strip for Channel 4, and so she had a very early commission from Channel 4. I said, listen, we should start a music video company, but let's do it a little bit differently. The different way in which we did it is that we got a bunch of established film directors to make videos alongside a bunch of young people to make videos, because both of our ambition was to work as producers in film. And so we got Derek Jarman, was a very good friend of ours, an avant-garde filmmaker, and he made the first set of videos. Nicholas Rogue, and most importantly Stephen Frears. And at the same time, I got a bunch of young directors signed up as well. And in that music video time, is what I learned was that because what we had to do as the producers, we had to run a company, we had to get a budget, we had to spend the amount of money that we got from the budget on the music video, try and make a little bit of a profit so that one had something to live off. But most importantly, in terms of setting up my future career, in terms of setting up movies, is you had to go and pitch them, basically. Is you had to go to the music companies and you had to sell the idea, along with the director, who usually didn't really know what they were talking about, the idea and so you had to sell these ideas to commissioners of music videos who were within the music companies, and you had to, and to the bands. And I quickly learned that actually, sort of no one really knew what the hell they were talking about. And that if you had a little bit of confidence and maybe made them laugh a couple of times, you stood a pretty good chance of getting the commission. And guess what? It's exactly the same in the movie business as well. so it's a very valuable early lesson that I got from the early days of making music videos. Still, by the way, pre-video, pre-DVD, pre-anything like that. And it is amazing when you think it's just over 30 years ago. But things have just changed out of like any, here we are talking about coronavirus, everyone at the moment thinking, well, I've never seen anything like that. But you also think relatively the rate of visual communication over that period of time is just unbelievable. No mobile phones. My first movie, which is coming up as the next part of the story, I got a car phone. And when I got the car phone, I chucked it in the back of the car, and all of a sudden the car went like that. It was so big. So we were working away on these music videos, and as I said, Channel 4 had just begun. And one of the things that Channel 4 did in its early days is it wanted to commission a bunch of films, basically. And a very lovely, sadly now dead, commissioning editor, David Rose, and he and his assistant, Karen Bamber, they went around all of the theatres in the country, and they got the writers in residence at the various theatres to write a screenplay. And one of the places they went to was the Royal Court, and the Royal Court writer in residence was a guy called Hanif Qureshi. And he wrote a script about his community and about something that he knew about, which was called My Beautiful Laundrette. And he finished the script, and he gave it to Stephen Frears. And Stephen had directed a couple of music videos, dreadfully for me, but we got on pretty well. One for Andrew Lloyd Webber, which was a Requiem mass, and one for a band called Heaven 17. But although the videos were awful, Stephen and I got on very well together. And he said to me one day, look, I've been given this script by Hanif, and I think it's quite interesting. So I read it, and it was amazing. It was an insight into this world that no one knew anything about, and all the rest of it. And he said, okay, listen, he'd just made a couple of films, and he'd worked for the BBC a lot in drama, but I think he really liked the young people that I'd introduced him to on the music videos, and all of these different people who were working in like camera and design and all the rest of it. And he thought, it'd be quite interesting to have this sort of livelier bunch make this film. So he said, do you want to produce it? Do you and Sarah want to produce it? And we said, okay, yeah, why not? I was 25. And he said, we got to get the money. And I said, okay, right, what are we doing? He said, okay, got to go and see these guys at Channel 4. So we walked in. Channel 4 in those days was in Charlotte Street in London, now called something posh. But we walked up Charlotte Street, and as we were walking up Charlotte Street, Stephen said to me, I only make films in February. What didn't know what he was talking about. This is November. And so we go in, we have a very polite meeting, we talk about the script, and they say, how much is it going to cost? And I thought, it's dollars for movies, isn't it? It's not pounds. So I said, $1 million. And they said, okay. And they said, when you want to make it? And I said, well, he only makes films in February, so we need to get started. And that was that, basically. So that was the easiest movie, I can promise you, and I've made well over 100 since then, to ever get commissioned. Should I just keep going? Yeah. Yeah, okay, I'm on a roll. So we made the movie one of the important things for that, there were 4 people who were up for the lead. There was Gary Oldman, Daniel Day-Lewis, Tim Roth, and Branagh. And Dan had just been in this, he's playing Frankenstein or something like that, and he was sort of super cool, blonde haired, unbelievably good looking guy, fantastic. we had tea with him and Stephen round at Stephen's house in Notting Hill. And Dan left, and I said, okay, we've got to cast him, come on. And Stephen said, no, this is a really tricky love story. We can't cast him until we see whether there's chemistry between him and Gordon, who played the other lead. So Dan had to come back for another tea, basically, so that we could all see whether there was chemistry between the two of them. And it was a really interesting thing, because actually, as one makes bigger and bigger movies, you don't often have that opportunity. And we've made some real clunky mistakes, basically, because if you offer to two movie stars, you don't have that opportunity to see whether that basic thing of chemistry is there between the two people that you want to see on screen. And so it was actually a fantastic lesson. Anyway, we made the film. Originally it was shot on 16mm, and it was sort of really destined for a little bit of a theatrical opening and then television. But what happened is we took it to the Edinburgh Film Festival, and it was one of those things where people's lives genuinely changed, because it was me, Steve and Sarah, Daniel, Hanif, all flew up to Edinburgh for the festival. And there was a fantastic old director, a guy named John Schlesinger, who's now dead but famous British director, who's a big old queen. And I knew he would like the movie, basically. So I doorstepped him. He was terrifying. He was very grand and really quite scary. But he was walking down Princes Street in Edinburgh, and I thought, okay, I'm going to go for it, basically. And I said, we've made a movie that I think you'd really love, and will you come to it tonight? And he did, and it helped make it into an event. And so it really kicked off from that. So we were very lucky. We'd made a movie, our first movie for Sarah and myself, that people seemed to like. And on the back of that, I learnt that all of a sudden there were these distribution people from all around the world coming to say, can I buy the rights to this and that and da-da-da. And I learnt, as it were, the economics of the way the film industry worked. And for the next 5 or 6 years, so the rest of the 80s and the early 90s, is we ran Working Title as an independent company. And we probably made 15 to 20 movies in that period. And we funded them in all sorts of different ways. I should say, one of the things that, when we did My Beautiful Laundrette, that I did is I thought that, okay, on this particular movie, is that Stephen and Hanif are really going to have the creative input into it. So what will I do? And I thought what I'll do is I'll really learn how every penny gets spent on the film, basically, and I'll really work on the production side of it, the proper ground production work, how every penny gets spent with the electricians, how it gets spent with the camera department, how the whole thing really works. And frankly, I was pretty bored by that, and I decided that actually that wasn't the area of producing that was something that was of great interest to me, but it was definitely an area of producing. It's like running any business. You need to know how the money's being spent, basically, and where it's being spent, and you also need to know if it's being spent badly, but actually the spending of it, sort of dull. And that I thought much more interesting is, one, the business side of how film works, which is how the bigger economy of film works, how you get a film paid for, and then how you basically get the money back. And secondly, the creative side of it is, i.e. what you're doing, is what the content is, who you get to be the principal people making it. And so that's really, and out of that, and then the films that we made afterwards, it became very clear that that's what I wanted to do. And the interesting thing is the business side of it then, and think this is again how things have changed completely. It was, you realise that actually on one end of the chain was you, the producer, and making something that was for an audience, and the audience was way over here. The person who was going to see it was way over there, basically. And in between you, the producer, and the audience were all of these people called distributors, sales agents, agents, another sales agent, another distributor, and all taking a little shave off the whole thing as it went along. And of course, that's the thing that has changed beyond all recognition now, because we've now got to the point where we have a streamer and you have a producer and there's only one person between them and the consumer, basically, which is the streamer, which is, say, Netflix or Amazon or whatever. And that's an amazing thing for the business, because it means that the creative people, although they may not be talking to the audience through the medium of cinema and inner cinema and all the rest of it, they are much closer to talking directly to their audience, and it's also just a sort of more satisfactory arrangement. So we one of the things I've always liked doing is working with a group of people. So in those 80s, early 90s, we got a group of young people together who formed the basis of Working Title, and that we, from having sold My Beautiful Laundrette, we learnt that actually you could pre-sell rights, you could sell to television, you could get a sales advance, you could fund these things in all sorts of different ways. And in those years, the independent cinema in America was very healthy, so you could pre-sell those rights. But the problem was it was all a little bit convoluted, and that we were independent producers, and that our income and our business depended on getting these things made, and all too often the deal was coming ahead of the film, basically, and so we were managing to put these great deals together that would get a film made, but the film wasn't necessarily that good, and we were having to put films into production that probably weren't ready to go into production. I should say one other important lesson from the music video years was that I learned to I started going to America. So in the early 80s, I started to go to New York and LA probably once every 4 to 6 weeks, and that's something up until now I've done pretty much all the time, because in the music business is very important out of Los Angeles and LA, and a lot of New York, and a lot of commissions came from there. But of course, most importantly in the film industry is you have to be able to deal with Hollywood, because that although you might not like it, it's a fact that the movie industry is really kind of sort of cottage industry, and the village is Hollywood, and in the village is representation for all talent, for all acting talent, for all writing talent, for all directing talent and producing talent. And that although those representatives can't force one of their clients to do something, they can certainly stop them from doing something. So you have to have those relationships. That there's all distribution comes out of Hollywood, basically, and most of funding comes out of Hollywood. So it's really important that one has a relationship. And in those days, again, pre-internet and pre all of the digital communication, if you didn't go there, you were forgotten pretty damn quickly, basically, because you were just a voice on the end, calling from London calling. So you had to have that relationship. And indeed, what we decided, and then have continued ever since, is sort of from around about the late 80s, is that we should have an outpost there, that we should have an office in LA. So we set up an office there. So we went through this independent period. And probably the most important, there's two massive pieces of luck in my career, and they both happened in very short shrift in this period of time. Is one of which is that an alumni of this very place had written a script, and he'd been here and he'd worked with a guy called Rowan Atkinson on a TV show called Not the 9 O'Clock News, but he'd written a feature film script. And his agent, a guy called Anthony Jones, introduced us in London, and that was a man named Richard Curtis. And we made his first movie, which is a film called The Tall Guy, in 1987, and that began probably, I've actually produced every single thing that Richard has ever written, I think. In the cinema business, so it began one of the most successful British talent producer relationships of all time, because those films have gone on to make huge amounts of money and be very successful. But anyway, so Richard wrote The Tall Guy. We produced it. We actually sold it to. It was one of the very first films to be sold to Miramax, in actual fact. So there was this whole Harvey Weinstein story, which we won't get into, that was attached to that one. But a couple of years after it was finished, I'd funded it by pre-selling the whole thing to a British television company, and in those days they wrote the cost of the film off as it was transmitted or something like that. So the film was okay, but didn't make a whole lot of money. And I got a royalty check, and it's from a company called London Weekend Television. It was for £100,000, I remember very well. And we were completely broke at the time. And I thought, wow, that's going to keep us going for another month or two. But for some reason, honesty got the best part of me that day. And I remember there were a couple of Profit participants on the tour guide, one of which was Mel Smith, another late alumni, and Richard. And I sent Richard a check for 15 grand. And he was so surprised to receive this check that he sent me the manuscript for the script that he'd just written, which was called 4 Weddings and a Funeral. So there's a moral in that story, I think. So that was one bit of luck. That was the beginning of and at the end of the day, being a film producer is all about your creative relationships. It's all about it, because making movies is an idiotic business, because like what you basically do is you create a business, you sell a business, and you start again on the next film. So most businesses, if you make baked beans, you just invent baked beans and you keep on selling baked beans for the rest of your life. You don't do that in the movie business. You do 4 Weddings and a Funeral, and then you finish that, and then you do another one, and it's a complete start. But the only continuity that you can possibly get, and if you look at Working Title, and one of the reasons that Working Title sits in a place of its own a little bit, is because of the creative relationships that we have. Because the one thing that mitigates that stupidity of starting a new business each time is if you're working with the same people, if you're working with the same writers, same directors, and all the rest of it. And if you look at the canons of work from Richard, from Lee Hall as writers, from Edgar Wright, Joe Wright, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we did. So first bit of luck in that time was Richard. Second thing was I was broke. Company was broke. And you thought, this is no way that we're having to make these films before they're ready to go. And you thought, this is just stupid. And that I sort of thought in my head, okay, either you're going to have to go, if you really want to make films, you're going to have to go and live in LA because that's where it's easier. Or you're going to have to find some money. And I was in Los Angeles and I bumped into this guy at a hotel who I'd known from the music business, and this was in 1992. And he was there on behalf of Polygram, which is one of the big music companies, and this shows again how times have changed so much, is that and the record companies at that point, pre-digital world, were just making so much money that Polygram and the other record companies were looking at ways in which they may be able to diversify in other creative areas to go into. And he'd been mandated to go and take a look at the film industry, and that he decided the best way of sort of taking a look at the film industry would be to take a strategic interest in a couple of companies. And he took an interest in a company called Propaganda, which was run by a guy named Steve Golan, who sadly died last year. And from our conversation and all the rest of it, is he took an interest in Working Title as well. He's a man named Michael Kuhn. And that he took an interest in the company. They started to slowly pay for our overhead. We collectively formed a sales company, and then very quickly the Polygram thing accelerated, and he set the system up where he had a number of creative labels and then a distribution pod at the center, basically, which is the last crack at a non-Hollywood company to become a studio, and we were lucky enough to be part of that. And at that point, that's where I met Eric, and Sarah, and my partner up to that point decided that she didn't want to, because she felt it was too corporate, to be part of that. And Eric had a very parallel career to myself. He'd done music videos, he'd done a couple of films. He was a sort of doer, and I think we both thought, okay, if we get together, it may be one of those situations where we can make 1 and 1 equal more than 2, and that, that seems to be what happened. And I think it's worthwhile talking a little bit about the foundation of the company at that point, because it's pretty much, and this is in 1992, it's pretty much exactly the same as what we run today, which is it's a funded production house with a pretty big overhead that, and basically what Working Title does is it develops material for films. And that it then, having developed material for films, is it finances those films and then produces those films, and then somebody else distributes those films. And winding back to the beginning of that, is we literally, with a blank sheet of paper, said, okay, what would a really good production company look like? And we thought, okay, the engine room of this thing has to be developed, finding good material. and developing it into screenplays, basically. And that we need to have a combination of both people in the UK, but we also need to have people in LA doing that, because LA is the sales ground for this sort of stuff. And that we've got to get world-class people doing that, because that is it. If we don't have really good IP, then we don't make decent movies. And if we don't know how to turn those really good ideas into good screenplays, is we don't make decent movies. So that really has to be where we invest an enormous amount of time and energy. And within that, we need to split up the sources of that material. Is that we need to have an expertise in the publishing trade. We need to have somebody who really knows publishing both in Britain and in New York really well, so that you can get to that book or that magazine or that article or whatever before anybody else. We need to have people who've really developed scripts with writers, because half of the writing process is getting the writer to write and paying the writer to write, but it's also easing it and teasing it along, basically, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. What else would we like in that production company? Once we've got this perfect screenplay, we need to have in order to get to that perfect screenplay, we need to have a legal team to work on. Everything you do in producing films is transactional, and every transaction needs a contract of some sort. And up until that point, we'd done it externally, and we got external lawyers to do it. We thought it was actually going to work to bring people in-house. So now we've got 4 or 5 lawyers who work in-house for us. Then we had a couple, and they do everything from that first rights agreement or that first writing agreement all the way through to the artist agreement, the funding agreements, the location agreements, this, that, and the other, basically. So that's a massive job. But also, the other thing we do as producers, a lot of producers tend to make their talent deals themselves, as we use our business affairs people to do our talent deals, because it gives us the opportunity to not get sullied in the relationship, basically, of a writer or a director or whatever being resentful about their deal. So we can just blame business affairs and pretend that we didn't know anything about it. Which still works. So you need that. Then you need a production. So if you're gonna turn this perfect script into a film, is you need a production department to do that. So to work out how much it's going to cost, where you're going to do it, who's going to work on it, and all the rest of it. So we have those people in-house. We have a marketing person in-house, and we have a music person in-house. So that's basically the team that we set up then. We got lucky in those early days at Polygram in the 90s, because the second or third film that we did was Four Weddings, and Four Weddings was a real pivot point for not only Working Title, but for the film business in the UK. And the reason for that was that you had up until that point, one is everyone had said, don't do comedy, doesn't sell, doesn't travel. So I thought, okay, so we'll definitely do comedy. Is everyone said, English language, non-American, doesn't work, forget it, nobody in the world wants to see that. So I thought, okay, don't believe that either. And probably they just said a bunch of other nonsense as well. Four Weddings was a small British movie about a very small sector of our society that was entertaining, that found a movie star, that cost $4 million and made $300 million around the world, basically. And it blew the lid off the fact that you had to be American in order to have a successful commercial film outside of Hollywood. And really that was the basis of and has been the basis of our business, as we said, okay, you can make non-American English language films that will not only work in your own market, which is the UK, but they'll also work all around the world. And that actually, unlike those American films, America is just another territory. We don't have to pretend it's the be-all and the end-all. It's just part of the whole financial equation. So that was a really important thing, and we followed that up with a series of pretty successful, both creatively and artistically, creatively and commercially, films in that period, because we started doing the Rowan Atkinson movies at that point, but also we started doing the Coen Brothers films as well. And we, the thing where we were very lucky is that Richard proved through his success to be quite a honeypot for talent here in the UK, and because of the coolness of the Coens, basically, they proved to be quite a good honeypot for talent in the US. And we basically in the 90s period is we managed to establish ourselves as producers of quality movies that would travel around the world, that we were good guys to work with, that we're a pretty good buffer for a more creative writer-director type person to deal with Hollywood. Because Hollywood is pretty brash and pretty tricky and can absolutely squish creative types, and we've learned how to listen to that side and interpret it to that side, basically, with success. So, yeah, I'm just about to run. Do you want to ask me another question?
Something that I've noticed from some of your most famous movies is they have quite common lead actors. So, for example, Eddie Redmayne in The Danish Girl, The Theory of Everything, and then Anna Karenina with Keira Knightley.
Yeah.
Is this something that you consciously have to do, like develop relationships?
I think
with
the relationships with the acting talent, with the directing talent, and the writing talent, that is critical, and that again, you also have to replenish it all the time. I mean, one of the reasons that we've managed to stay relatively on our toes and current is that we're very conscious that that it is a constant replenishment. So we've just done this Emma movie with Anya Taylor-Joy. So she, and she's in another one of our movies, and so you establish that rhythm with them, and actually, like with Eddie and with Hugh and with Keira and with Kate, is that we've because you've done their first films and you've been part of their early success. If they're Hugh, then they'll resent you for that. But if they're anyone else, they'll quite like you for it, basically. But actually, it's funny. I was reading a script yesterday. I had a medical appointment, and just before I thought I'll just read the script. And it's about it's a sort of middle-aged romantic comedy, and it was down near the Chelsea Westminster Hospital. And I was giggling away and thought, okay, and then I thought, oh shit, I've got to go to the doctor. And I spun around and bumped straight into Hugh, who was behind me. So I thought, wow, well, that might be serendipitous. But yes, I think so those relationships are really, really important, that we don't consciously necessarily, we consciously develop we would consciously develop with writer-directors. In fact, let me just wind back a little bit and I'll talk a little bit about the whole development process, because I think that is quite interesting to people, is that broadly, what sort of material do and how does it find its way to us? Well, broadly, I think there's three ways that material comes through the door. Is that one of which is, I've already alluded to, which is sort of books, magazines, articles, and all the rest of that, and probably at least half of our material comes in like that, and that you either pick up a new book or an old book or an article or this, that, or the other, and that you think that could make a good movie, and that would be something that's worth pursuing. Secondly, is original ideas. Is that which are actually more difficult, believe it or not, but actually that kicking, and this is a sort of more internal thing where you kick around ideas, kick around worlds that you might make a film from. Then thirdly is the creative relationships, basically. So as you establish the creative relationships, is that an Edgar Wright will bring you his next movie, or a Richard Curtis will bring you his next movie, or a Joel and Ethan will bring you their next movie, and all the rest of it. It doesn't tend to be actors, is what I was getting to. It tends to be that it's writer-directors, those creative relationships, which are the real foundation of the whole thing. And because that's the real journey. Is the actor only comes in at quite late on in the process in many ways. Is that once you know where you're headed, is that when we've decided on a piece of material, is it actually works quite systematically. Is that what happens is either Eric or I attach ourselves to, and this is for TV or for film, will be the lead producer on it. That will then get one of our senior development executives, either from the UK or from the US, to be on it, and we'll get a junior person. And if there's no writer attached, which usually there's not, is that we'll then go out, we'll do a list of potential script writers, and there'll probably be both people from here and from the US, and there'll be people who are established and there are people who are not established. And we'll go out to usually around about 5. So we do a list and say these 5 people. For some reason, 5 seems to be the number that we always do. And we'll put the idea, be it a book or be it a pitch or be it whatever, out to them. And we'll take various meetings to see whether we like the approach or not. And then establish who we're going to commission to write it. Then what will happen is there'll be a series of meetings where we really dive in, before the writers put pen to paper, where we really dive into what the essence of the film is, and out of that we'll try and get not a treatment but a kind of roadmap, 2 or 3 pages basically, of what the structure of the piece is going to look like, or where the act breaks are going to be, and what we're going to try and do, so that you sort of have a little bit of an indication of the direction of travel for the whole thing, and then you'll send a writer off to do their first draft. And this is a sort of sweeping generalisation, because the script writing process is a long and complex one, and it tends to be very many drafts. But what you're hoping to get from that first draft is a sense of what the story is, basically, is what is driving us from A to Z in this whole thing. And that a hint of what the emotions might be, and a sort of probably quite bare characters. And if you get that, that's fine, basically. The script development process of coming back to it and back to it and back to it is to then try and get those characters to come to life, and then for those characters to start to carry the story and to come to some sort of emotional resolution. If it's a comedy, it's funny. If it's a horror movie, it's scary. If it's an action adventure, it's exciting, and all the rest of it. Now that all sounds quite simplistic, but it's really difficult, and it's really difficult on both the script writer's behalf, and it's really difficult on behalf of the executives as well. And you have to be patient, and you have to go at it and go at it and go at it. And experienced, I asked Richard Curtis once what his ratio was, and he said 30 pages to a line. So he writes 30 pages, and of that 30 pages he might get a line, basically. So you have to have that sort of patience for the whole process. But it is kind of fascinating, and it is absolutely the essence of everything. Because if you get that wrong, if you get that foundation wrong, and it's got a little crack in it, then everything else is the Leaning Tower of Pisa, basically. And you absolutely have to stick at it. And one of the reasons, winding back to the 80s when we were making those films that weren't ready to go into production, was I realised, oh my God, is the script development process is lengthy, and it should be expensive, and it should be that you can get to the end of it and be really honest with yourself and say, listen, I've spent $1 million on this, but it's not going to work. And you should be able to be in a position corporately where you can say, we'll take the hit for that, because it's better to write off $1 million on the bad screenplay rather than to raise the $20 million to make a bad movie that then loses $50 million, basically. So it's like, you have to be able to do that. Now, as we get more long in the tooth, as it were, our ratio gets a little bit better, in that we'll develop stuff that we have a better sense can be turned into a movie. But that equation is still absolutely true. You still have to be able to turn around and say, you know what, we did our best, but this just isn't gonna cut it. It's difficult.
We'll take 1 or 2 questions from the audience for now. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, wait for the microphone to come to you, and stand up while asking me a question. Thank you.
Have you been?
Could we go to the member in the first row?
Hi there. I just wanted to ask, how approachable are working title with new ideas, and are you involved with any independent film companies, or is it all in-house?
Tends to be if we're totally material driven, so if we hear an idea that we really like and it comes with another independent company and all the rest of it is, we'll absolutely work with people in order to do that. And we're not tyrannical about that at all. But it absolutely comes down to the material, and that, is that we don't have all the good ideas by any means. And if there's a good idea out there that we really like and we respond to, then there's always a deal to be cut, basically, and we'll keep people involved.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Could we go to the member in the back?
Thank you very much for coming. I have a question. So you have a whole variety of great productions, and one that means something quite personal to me is the theory of everything. And I was just wondering, was there a special time that you decided to want to produce this film, or how did you decide
with
on
the
that
theory
point?
of everything?
Yes.
Yeah, that was. In fact, I should say that Eric and I slightly split the films up, basically, so that he's the lead producer on some and I'm the lead producer on others. Is that he was the lead producer on that, in fairness. So, but with the theory of everything is that Anthony McCartan, who wrote it, pitched it to us, and we really liked the idea and we thought it was definitely a challenge to make it cinematically interesting. And then James Marsh, who's the director, came on quite early on and worked closely with Eric and Anthony in terms of the development of the script. And then Eddie came on, and the rest was history. He's sort of perfect for it. And Eddie's a really interesting example of somebody who we have had a very long-term relationship with, actually, because he was in Elizabeth the Golden Age, was his first movie in a small part, but then he was in Les Mis, and he was in Theory, and he was in something else. But I think the thing is that when you get an actor, and it's happened maybe 10 times in our career, who's sort of on the cusp but sort of perfect for what they're doing, and they deliver, like Hugh did in Four Weddings, or Keira did arguably in Pride and Prejudice. Certainly Cate Blanchett did in Elizabeth. Certainly Eddie did in Theory of Everything. Is something exponential happens, because I think the audience, because they're sort of aware, but they're not aware that there's a person, and then boom, there's an explosion, and it's very exciting. It's one of the most exciting things that happens in cinema, and it's really exciting to be in the audience when you see that sort of blossoming, as it were. And I think that sort of nobody, and it's, on the whole, it's because nobody knew they had it in them, as it were, and nobody knew Eddie had that in him. And when they saw it, that's what sort of it completely pulled the movie. And I think the other thing that's really important, because we're involved in the marketing of our films and the way they sell and all the rest of it, and you have to decide quite early on what is the ingredient that you're going to really push out there and that's going to pull everything else along. And that both that film and Darkest Hour with Gary Oldman, which came in quite quick succession, you knew, okay, you've got towering performances here. If you don't get behind the towering performance, there's no point trying to sell a film or trying to sell this film about science or this film about the second one. Actually get behind the towering performance and let that. And in both cases, that worked pretty well. 2 Academy Awards.
Thanks. Could we go to the member in the first row?
Thanks for being here, Tim. Your remarks about the kind of maintaining relationships being a really important part of what you do made me think of the film The Player from the 90s with Tim Robbins. I think it's an excellent satire on that kind of stuff. On a related note, you commented about Hollywood being that kind of epicenter village of things and showing your face being absolutely crucial for survival. That kind of made me think of what Bong Joon-ho said about the Oscars this year being like a local film festival. Yeah. I was wondering if you thought, with the success of Parasite and also Celine Sciamma's new film, Portrait of a Lady on Fire, these international releases becoming like way more successful and popular than ever before.
I think one of the things which is brilliant, by the way, I saw Parasite halfway through last year and thought, well, that's the movie, but I bet they never vote for it. And it was fantastic that they did. Is that I think Netflix has really delivered on that front, which is it used to be that you've got to go for every sector of the audience that you possibly can, and what Netflix has said is, listen, if there are enough left-handed, pink people in Russia who like this thing, then and enough of them will buy into Netflix to see it. Let's make it, sort of thing. And that so is, you know, I think it would be pretty risky now to, for instance, to do a film about any form of foreign person and have an actor playing Johnny Foreigner using the English language. I think that Netflix have moved that on so much, basically, that an audience is expecting to see those people speaking in their native tongue subtitled, basically. And that's really exciting. It's one of the brilliant things that Netflix has done for our industry. And I think and in a way, there's been a reverse bleed back into the movie business because of that, which is I don't think Parasite could have happened without Netflix paving the way in a funny sort of way for an audience to be more open-minded.
You mentioned that when you saw Parasite, you thought that's the film.
Bing. Well, because you just saw it's perfect storytelling. It's perfect storytelling. Is that, you know, and it's not patronising in any way, shape, or form. Here it is, and the subtext is laid out right in front of you. It's perfect screenplay. And then if you watch it twice, it should have won everything else as well because it was shot on a set. So easily the best production design. They built every single square inch of that, basically, that you wouldn't ever know. Beautifully lit, you know. It's just like everything about it was like for me, it was like a sort of perfect movie, and it's like why you do it. And it just it had that resonance. But I thought, oh well, it's a foreign language film. And having, you know, most years at the Academy Awards, easily the best films are the 5-6 foreign language films, which everyone comes to last, but then you see these films and they're just fantastic.
Your own films, the working title films, have won so many awards themselves. Is there something that you think binds all winning films together for Best Picture, for example? Can you see a sort of common theme, and how can you predict?
Not really. I think, and also we don't. We're a little bit jaded by it, but it's a bit of a game, the whole awards season thing, and it comes from distribution for us, so that if there's a certain sort of film, you'll open it into that corridor. And there's a couple of film festivals, there's the Venice Film Festival and the Toronto Film Festival that come very close together, which is at the beginning of so films like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and Atonement and Elizabeth all played that game, as it were. Darkest Hour played that game. You know, but you need to know, now you really need to know that you've got the goods. And one of the things that we do is we test our films, basically. So in the well, all movies do it, but in the post-production part of the film where you're cutting the movie, is you put it up in front of an audience and get very detailed questionnaires from them. And you also, there's a rating system on that as well, and you do that here and you do that there. Now you do it a lot, like a comedy or something, it's obvious, you know, you're trying to make people laugh, and if they're not laughing or they're missing the gag, as you hear that. But also, you need to look for that now, I think, to play the award season, you need that rating. You really need to take a notice of that, and you shouldn't kid yourself unless you're really scoring high with audiences. Then stay away from it. Stay away from the whole.
So, what was that process like for Cats?
Well, the thing about Cats is, and it's, you know, it was a disaster. But
which is why I'm curious how.
But we never had that process because, right. And that actually we should have done that process all the way through. But it was a very heavily visual effects film where the visual effects got a long way behind. So everything was green right up until the last moment. So you never had the opportunity. And of course, you should have put that film up, you know, a year ago in front of an audience so that you could course correct. You know, which and. For various reasons, that didn't happen. We really, with that movie, what we should have done is we should have finished a test, but the technology of what they were doing with the cats and all the rest of it was breaking ground. But before we shot the movie, we should have done a test where you then put it up in front of an audience, and you'd have learned so much from it. And I bet you it wouldn't have, you know, you'd have course corrected, but it wouldn't have needed as much course correction as everyone thinks it would have needed in order to actually shift the result on that movie. But it was a howler of an example of not doing that, basically. You know, and if you look at, and it's the way different studios work, but if Disney were doing that movie, like when Disney did the second Mary Poppins, they'd finished that film a year before they released it. So they were course correcting all the time, basically, in terms of, and also not caring about how much money they spent on it.
We'll go to another question. The member in the purple sweater in the second row.
Thank you. Just to follow up on his question on Los Angeles being the epicenter of the movie theatre, we had Stanley Tucci on Tuesday, and he mentioned that lots of films these days are being filmed in London and in Prague. So I was wondering, has it shifted?
No, I think that's the production side of it has. So that London, because of the tax credit, we're probably the London up until a couple of weeks ago was absolutely the epicenter is becoming the epicenter of production, and we've got great, and it has been basically in the early noughties when Gordon Brown was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. There'd all been all these sorts of Mickey Mouse tax schemes and all the rest of it that existed around film. And he said, listen, I love film, Tony Blair loves film, let's see whether we can't come up with a system that gives a producer a decent financial incentive to be here. And he came up with what's called the tax credit, which every administration since then has gone with, basically, which is an incentive, a 15 to 20% incentive to film here, because they worked out that actually on movies, when a big movie shoots and says this is a $200 million movie, it's not like other businesses where we'll spend $200 million over the next 10 years sort of thing. They spend $200 million, and actually that's a massive thing for the local economy. So he really got the tax credit sorted out, and so and building from that, London became a hub, and the Marvel movies started to shoot here, the Bond movies obviously shoot here, the Star Wars films started to shoot here, Netflix started to shoot here, and so the crews and people have built up. So we are in production terms, absolutely. Now, sadly, we're not telling our own stories on the whole. We're facilitating worldwide cinema stories, and so actually Hollywood is still the centre of it. And then they go back there quite often well, they don't actually, they finish them here, but to market them, distribute them, people them, finance them, that's all out of Hollywood.
You've touched upon this a bit during the event so far, but can you tell us in more depth how the coronavirus outbreak has affected your day-to-day work?
Like any other business, it's going to, no one's seen anything like what's going on at the moment, and it's scary. And I think that everyone's frightened, but basically making films is a supply chain, and if the supply chain gets badly broken, then you have to stop. And so that we're being done at both ends because we have to stop, because it's completely irresponsible to go into production where for events beyond your own control are going to stop it at some point, and they will stop it in the current climate, and that people are not going to be going to the cinemas either while this is all going on. So it's a double end, but we're no worse than any other industry, and I think I say to our staff, listen, we're in territory that we've never been in before. You've got to be considerate, you've got to be kind, you've got to do the right thing, that we'll get through it, and that actually that it's the same for everyone, because the main issue on films is locking people in, these different schedules and all the rest of it. I said, and I've been saying this today, listen, this is just a pause. And it's not only us who's pausing, it's everybody's got to pause while we get through this. And then we'll all come up again and keep going from where we were before. And actually, there has to be decency to get through this whole thing too. It's like, hopefully it'll bring that out some in people. But it's going to be a long holiday.
And my final question before we end is, on a more positive note, from all the movies that you've done, are there a few favourites that
There are a few favourites, yeah. I think there's probably that, I think I did a film with Paul Greengrass shortly after 9/11 called United 93, which was about the fourth plane. And it was an incredible piece of filmmaking, and it used cinema in a visceral, dynamic way that I hadn't really, and it was a completely different sort of experience of filmmaking that was very satisfactory to make and scary to watch, but an amazing film. I think Atonement, which was a very difficult adaptation of a literary book, was a sort of perfect screenplay, perfect director at his prime, basically his second film, where he really knew what he was doing and also it was something that couldn't have, although it was a book, it sort of couldn't have been anything else. And you know, if you look at the sort of narrative leaps in Atonement, where you go from a drawing room to the middle of the war to somebody's imagination and all the rest of it, where you think, well, nobody said they're going to follow that, basically, but we did as an audience. So I think that's a real testament to filmmaking. And then, you know, probably Love Actually, because that's the sort of epicenter of all of those romantic comedies, and it brings everything that Richard's so brilliant at doing together. And you know, however many years later, nearly 20 years later, it's still a perennial film which people watch every Christmas.
Did you anticipate that at the time that it was made?
No, but I remember the read-through of that, and because there were so many famous people in it, and we had this read-through in Notting Hill, 20th Century Props, and Colin first turned around to me and said only Richard Curtis could make his read-through like the most starry premiere we've ever been to. Basically. So no, but you didn't know. Well, we didn't know the je ne sais quoi of the Christmas thing. Yeah. The Christmas thing is what you know has kept it alive in a funny sort of way. And we knew it was a sort of Christmas movie, but we didn't know that actually we were making a Christmas movie that hasn't been matched subsequently. I mean, somebody will, I'm sure, but and that's a great thing. So that you got that every year, people coming back to it.
Yeah.
It's a comfort movie too. You know, it's good.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. But thanks so much again. Please join me in thanking Tim.